Okay.
Have we hit 7 o'clock? My clock doesn't quite say that yet.
Not quite, but
Okay.
I did start live streaming, so.
Okay. But this to the
Will?
We can trim that later.
Okay. This isn't on Facebook, right?
Right. This is a private live stream that people can request the link for.
Okay.
Will, are you watching the waiting room?
Yes.
Okay. Then I won't mess with it. So my clock now says 7. So how about we get started? Folks ready? All right. That's great. Hold on here, my computer. All right. So welcome everyone to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. In case you're new to New Hampshire Peace Action, we're a group dedicated to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to start off with an acknowledgement that we are doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. A quick word on Zoom etiquette. We love it when you keep your video on so we can see everyone's faces and reactions and feel connected, though we understand not everyone has video or feels comfortable with that. And then, of course, the other side is we ask that you keep your audio muted if you're not the one talking. Feel free to use chat for your comments, reactions, and questions that come up, and we will go over that later in the program. Our every other week online conversation series has been a way to help us engage, learn, and discern how to make the changes we've been yearning for. The upheavals of 2020 inspired us to start this, and we plan to keep them going as one way to not return to business as usual. I will say here that as an organization, New Hampshire Peace Action does work on numerous issues. Tonight's program especially connects to building a culture of peace and anti-racism work, two aspects that we feel are crucial to finding peace and justice in our society. I am happy now to welcome Joel Berman, Nancy Jo Shabbat, and Scott Dickman, all New Hampshire residents who have made multiple compassionate listening trips, mostly to Israel, Palestine, but their most recent journey in January 2020 was to the deep south of the US. And they're here to tell us about it. Please join me in welcoming Joel, who will tell us more.
Hi. Thanks, Amy, and thanks New Hampshire Peace Action for inviting Nancy Jo and Scott and me to be able to make our presentation. And thanks to everyone out there, many familiar faces, several people who accompanied us to Alabama. So there's Sarah and Taria and our fearless leader Yael and Janine. So we really welcome you, and we're delighted to have you here. I'm going to pause for a sec to share my screen. So for those of you who aren't familiar with compassionate listening, what we aim for as compassionate listeners is a quality of listening that creates a safe space for people to express themselves honestly and fully in search of their own truth. As listeners, our intent isn't to guide speakers towards what we might think is in their best interest, but rather to allow them to keep their own hands on the steering wheel as they explore their own life experiences and conflicts. Compassionate listening is based on the conviction that each of us has the ability to heal our own wounds and repair our damaged relationships. So as compassionate listeners, we have to be willing to be changed by what we hear. You can learn more about compassionate listening on our website. You can see the address there, compassionatelistening.org, and I'll say a little bit more about it at the very end. One of the most gifted compassionate listeners I've known is Tom McSteen. He's that handsome, smiling, tall blonde guy at the center of the last row of this photo of our group in Montgomery. It brings me great sadness to tell you that Tom died unexpectedly early last month at the tragically premature age of 60. So Scott and Nancy Jo and I are dedicating this presentation to Tom and his abiding spirit that illuminates the lives of every one of us who knew Tom and loved him. Let's take a moment of silence to honor his memory. Thank you. So why visit Alabama? I've always considered myself a curious traveler, but I have to admit I've never been curious about visiting Alabama. On my mental map, Alabama sits in the center of a solid red state bridge of bigotry stretching from South Carolina to South Dakota, the land of stars and bars, the state that didn't decriminalize marriage between African Americans and white Americans until 2001, the state that 67 years after Brown v. Board of Education still has a constitution that mandates, quote, separate schools for white and colored children, end quote. You can look it up. Alabama is the only state that doesn't require a unanimous jury to sentence a defendant to death. The state that last year executed 45-year-old African-American Nate Woods for murders he didn't commit, in the face of a confession from the man who did. If I kept a bucket list, Alabama wouldn't even make it to the bottom. For me, Alabama's always been a land and a state of mind best left unvisited. And then came an offer I couldn't refuse from my dear friend, Yael Petretti. Yael is here. You can wave to the folks, Yael. Yael decided that she's a leader in the compassionate listening community for several decades and decided that after traveling to some of the world's most contentious hotspots over the years, it was time for the Compassionate Listening Project to visit hotspots right here in our own country. First stop, Alabama. So for a week in January 2020, Scott and Nancy Jo and I joined 21 other people on a journey to a place I never thought I'd visit. Now, there are lots of tours you can take to the civil rights landmarks in the Deep South, but I don't know any that do what Yael was proposing. To listen not just to civil rights advocates, but also to people on the polar opposite side of the political spectrum. I'm talking right-wing Republicans. So could I hold fast to my moral convictions while recognizing the humanity of those whose political views I often find anathema? And why would I want to listen to folks who so often seem to stand in the way of the fight for equality and social justice? I'm going to share the screen again. So to explore these questions, let's begin with a reading of an edited transcript of Washington Post journalist Jonathan Capehart, read by Scott Dickman, as he interviews California Congresswoman Barbara Lee, read by Amy. And the third voice you'll hear is that of Peggy Wallace Kennedy, the daughter of former Alabama Governor George Wallace. She'll be read by Nancy Jo Shavit.
Good evening. Today is May 16th, 2019, and I'm Jonathan Capehart. Our story this week is one of compassion and new beginnings. It's about building bridges, and it's about George Wallace. Yes, that George Wallace, 45th governor of Alabama, known as the man who during the 1963 inaugural address said, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." The man who the Reverend Martin Luther King once called the most dangerous racist in America. But George Wallace is also the man who in 1982 ran for governor for a fourth and final term and won 90% of the Black vote. To understand how this happened, let's go back 10 years to 1972, when George Wallace was running for president. While campaigning in Laurel, Maryland, he was shot 5 times and permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Excuse me. Shirley Chisholm, the first ever Black congresswoman, was also running for president. When she heard about the shooting, she actually suspended her campaign so she could visit Wallace in the hospital. And Barbara Lee, the currently then serving 12-term congresswoman from California, was a college student at the time and was organizing Chisholm's Northern California campaign. At the time, Lee was also a member of the Black Panther Party. I talked to Congresswoman Lee about this as we stood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, made infamous by the horror of Bloody Sunday.
George Wallace was the epitome of an oppressor. And it was obnoxious to me that here we were in 1972, dealing with the reemergence of the old Jim Crow that Shirley Chisholm was working to end, and then the campaign was suspended, so that Shirley Chisholm could go visit George Wallace in the hospital. I said, "What? No way. How in the world could this Black woman visit this horrible individual?"
I'm Peggy Wallace Kennedy, and when Congresswoman Chisholm sat by my daddy's bed, he asked her, "What are your people going to say about your coming here?" Shirley Chisholm replied, "I know what they're going to say, but I wouldn't want what happened to you to happen to anyone." Daddy was overwhelmed by her truth and her willingness to face the negative consequences of her political career because of him, something he had never done for anyone else.
I said to Shirley Chisholm, "How could you do that? This man is running against you. He's trying to maintain the status quo that you're trying to change." She shook her finger at me and said, "Little girl, sometimes we have to remember we're all human beings, and I may be able to help him regain his humanity, to help him see something that he has not seen." She said, "You always have to be optimistic that people can change and that you can change, and that one act of kindness may make all the difference in the world. You have to rise to the occasion if you're a leader, and you have to try to break through and enlighten other people who may hate you." She said, "This is who we are as Black people. We're not haters, and we're not going to live our lives mean-spirited and angry." That's what Shirley Chisholm taught me.
Jonathan here, and it should be noted that neither Wallace nor Chisholm won the Democratic nomination that year, but it was the beginning of something else for Wallace.
Shirley Chisholm had the courage to believe that even George Wallace could change. She had faith in him. In 1972, Shirley Chisholm planted a seed of new beginnings in my father's heart, a chance to make it right, an opportunity to begin a 7-year journey. On a Sunday in 1979, Daddy's arrival at the King Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery was unannounced and unexpected. Other than an attendant rolling his wheelchair to the front of the sanctuary, he was alone. what the congregation must have thought when he said, "I've learned what suffering means," in a way that was impossible. I think I can understand something of the pain that Black people have come to endure. I know I contributed to that pain, and I can only ask for your forgiveness. As he was leaving the church, the congregation began singing Amazing Grace.
Wallace's transformation not only included publicly renouncing racism, he also personally asked Black leaders for forgiveness. As governor, he appointed a record number of African Americans to state positions. Wallace even crowned the first Black homecoming queen at the University of Alabama. And in 1982, he was re-elected governor for a fourth and final term and won, again, with 90% of the Black vote.
In his book, Just Mercy, Brian Stevenson writes, "When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you otherwise can't see. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. You begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. You're about to meet 5 of the many people we met from whom we learned things that are hard to learn otherwise, who helped us recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. 4 of these meetings will be through readings of abridged transcripts of recordings we made of our listening sessions, and the other will be through 2 brief video clips. As you're listening to each speaker, we invite you to make a note of the following observations. Something that surprised you, something that challenged you, something you learned, something you might want to know more about, or attributes or values that you sense that the speakers might share. And feel at any time free to enter your observations into the chat as we go through the presentation. We'll first meet Ms. Wanda Battle, tour guide at Montgomery's Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, that same church where George Wallace came unannounced in 1979 to apologize for his racist behavior. As we entered the church, Miss Wanda greeted each of us at the door with this rib-crunching bear hug that gave new meaning to the phrase audacious hospitality. She opened the door to what felt like holy ground. I'm going to play a couple videos that'll give you a sense of her spirit. You might need to adjust your volume as you listen. As Miss Wanda described the history of the church, she seemed a conduit for a message coming from beyond her. About the power of perseverance and faith and a steadfast refusal to hate those who have harmed you. I want everyone I know to go to Montgomery and meet Miss Wanda. The following day, we met Miss Angie, our tour guide at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Civil Rights Memorial Center. Miss Angie is another charismatic and abundantly gifted woman with an endless supply of pithy aphorisms that I want to hang over my kitchen sink. She surprised me when she informed us that the state of Alabama requires all public school fourth graders to visit the Civil Rights Center so they can learn about Alabama's racist history when they're still at a malleable age. After giving us a tour of the center, Angie shared what it's like to deal with the many people who come here with less than open-hearted enthusiasm. Angie's reader will be Amy Antonucci.
I love living in Montgomery. Where else can you meet civil rights icons on the street? I want people to come here and discover that Alabama isn't just about hate and football. I've been at the Southern Poverty Law Center for 3 years and I love it. People walk in here and curse me out saying I hate this place. And people come in and hug me and say they love me. I embrace everything. One day, a guy said, I want you to know that I hate you all and I think this place sucks. I said, okay, sir, you're entitled to your opinion. I'm sorry you feel that way. He went on and on. All of a sudden, he said, why are you just standing there looking at me and smiling? I said, you just spoke your truth. I'm sorry you didn't have a pleasant experience, but I also thank you for your kind donation. I gave him service with a smile. Why let a person control you who you'll never meet again? A guy came here with his grandkids on a school field trip. He grew up in a racist family. His grandfather was an imperial wizard. At the end, he said, I heard you guys got this thing called the Wall of Hate. I said, the Wall of Hate? Why would we have a place like that? Then I said, oh, I know what you're talking about. You talking about that other museum. The Wall of Hate is at the Ku Klux Klan Museum. He looked surprised. Of course, that doesn't exist. Then he said, we're going to agree not to agree. You've got your way of thinking and I've got mine. I said, you came here all full of stuff and I've noticed that you've relaxed a little. You probably still don't like me because I'm Black and because I'm a woman, but that's okay. At least you're being honest with me. But at the end of the day, watch how your grandkids are reacting to this. If you go back home and you still have all this hate in your heart, it's okay as long as you're able to let them make their own choice. You didn't make the choice for yourself because you grew up in that hate. Hopefully, the generational curse has ended with you. One of his grandsons came up and hugged me and told me he was sorry for the way his people treated my people. The little kids are so honest. I love them. Miss Rihanna, our welcoming lady, had an incident where a guy came in and paid for 4 people. He flung the money at her. She was upset. When this guy came around back, I said, how would you feel if someone threw money at you? He was a big guy, about 6'4", wearing a big cowboy hat. He told me, I'm a God-fearing guy. I didn't mean any harm by it. People come in here mean-spirited and full of hate, praising God and saying, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? You already know what Jesus would do. Stop pretending you're a Christian when you're not acting like one. You can't let people think they can come in and take you over because then you become a slave. I refuse to be a slave, ever. If I have to bite my tongue or hit my punching bag when I get home, when I know that I have done right by you and I wasn't mean or ugly to you, I can go to bed at night and sleep well. It's not easy, but I do it. This is my calling. I come from a very Christian family. My grandparents never, not ever, told us to hate any race of people. When I was in the military, my drill sergeant hated women, especially Black women. He berated us every day. Sometimes I called my grandmother and cried on the phone. She'd say, hang in there, don't hate him, don't curse him, pray for him. And I was like, what? I'm supposed to do what? Pray for him? Are you kidding me? She said, yeah, that's what you're going to do. And I did. And it was the best thing I ever did. I want our visitors to leave inspired. Different people of different backgrounds coming together and having a conversation. That's where it starts. It took a lot of courage for you guys to come down here. There are so many people who are afraid to come to the South because of all the things they've heard. I embrace you. I do. I hope you feel different than when you came here. We love you.
So again, we invite you to reflect on your responses, what you've seen so far, anything that surprised you, challenged you, something you learned, something you want to know more about, attributes. Feel free to enter them into the chat. The next day, still in Montgomery, we met Jay Hinton. He's a medical malpractice lawyer who has a passion for history. Jay gave us a tour of Montgomery's White House of the Confederacy and the Alabama State Capitol building. His reader will be Scott Dickman.
Thank you for coming. I love people who want to know more about who we are. What came out of the 1800s was all terrible. There's a lot of wonderful stuff and a lot of lessons to be learned. I told your fearless leader, Yael, after going to the Equal Justice Museum on Saturday, you all need some detox. No, I'm joking. People make two errors with regard to Southern history. One is to look at the past with what I call presentism. Everybody looks at what happened through today's lens and can't imagine how people did what they did in times that were very different from today. The second error is that people conflate everything that happened in the 1860s into one basket. Take secession from the Union, for example. There were people who wanted to form a new country. There were people who didn't. There were people who wanted to go to war, and there were people who didn't. And there were people who supported slavery, and there were people who didn't. The war was not about slavery. Lincoln even said, it's not about slaves. Look at his first inaugural address. Look up what he wrote in the 1850s. It wasn't until the war was going so poorly in 1862 that Lincoln came out with the Emancipation Proclamation. Read it. It does not free one slave. The only place he had absolute authority to free slaves was Washington, D.C., and he didn't do it there. Places where the South had already been occupied by Northern troops did not free slaves either, even though the military had the authority to do it. Lincoln didn't want slavery to expand into the West, not because he was against slavery, but because he didn't want Black people in the West. He was in favor of the Liberia experiment. Before we go on, let me be very clear. Nothing you hear over the next 2 hours should be understood as Jay Hinton thinks slavery is a good thing and we want to go back there. No, not at all. But if you present any Southern history in a good light, people will call you a racist or uneducated or bigoted. That scares people off and wears them out. They don't want to deal with it, so they move on to another topic quickly. A lot of Southerners wonder, is it okay to say I'm proud that my ancestors fought and died in the Civil War? You can't say that without fear of some type of retribution. Nobody likes their ancestors to be maligned. For me, history is deeply personal. My great-great-grandfather was killed in Savannah by Sherman's troops. My great-great-grandfather next to him was a prisoner captured in North Carolina. Sorry. And my wife's great-great-grandmother sent 7 boys to the war and 6 of them died. There's a monument in Georgia to those boys. I gave a speech last year at a rededication of a Confederate memorial in the town of Beauregard in East Alabama, where a huge tornado recently killed 25 people last March. I began my speech by reading their names. They're the very same last names of people who died in the war between the states. We say it's awful that those people died in that tornado. We don't know if Mr. Jones was a racist. He might have been a cheater. He might have been on his 5th marriage. But as human beings, we say that hurts. And what's wrong with that? Shouldn't it be the same for Confederate soldiers? In my day job, I'm a lawyer, and I defend physicians and hospitals, nurses and pharmacists. What motivates me in my work is the same thing that motivates me about history. I'm always trying to figure out the rest of the story. You got a bad result during that surgical procedure, but what about your diabetes? What about the need to lose 200 pounds? What about your 4 previous knee surgeries? That wasn't my doctor's fault. That motivates me to say, wait a minute, there's more to this story than that. It's easy to see the bad. There's so much that we have in common and things that we can agree on. There's good in all of us.
Jay, as a compassionate listener, I'd like to know, how was this for you?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I didn't know what to expect. Were you coming here because you could say, if we could endure the most right-wing guy we could find, we could get a PhD in compassionate listening? The Equal Justice Initiative and the Southern Poverty Law Center attract a lot of people to Montgomery who want to be zealous social justice warriors. If you let me define that term, I might agree with you. But for the most part, it means you're just another version of the busybodies who came from the North to tell us what to do back in 1868.
Have you visited the lynching memorial?
Yes, I have. During Reconstruction, keep this in mind though, please. During Reconstruction, we had no government. There was a lot of vigilantism. Lynching happened in many states. Part of it was motivated by good things, swift justice for true wrongdoers. But the ugliest side of it was the racial ugliness. It's a sad commentary. It's awful. And I know as a good Presbyterian that there's evil in the hearts of men. We're not as bad as we might be, but not as good as we can be. So I thank you for coming. I'm so glad to have you guys here with us.
So again, reflect, is there anything that surprised you, that challenged you? Anything you learned? Something you want to know more about? Or attributes or values that speakers might share? Again, feel free to enter them into the chat at any time. That lynching memorial that Jay referenced is less than a mile from the Alabama state capitol. It's officially known as the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. For many of us, it was the most emotionally intense moment of our journey. And for me, just as wrenching as my visit to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., or Yad Vashem. You may need to adjust your volume as you listen to this video by Brian Stevenson.
We have been practicing silence about our history for a very long time. In this country, we don't talk about slavery, we don't talk about lynching, we don't talk about segregation. We have a hard time talking about race, and it has burdened us. We don't think it's odd that we don't talk about this history. We actually think it's odd when somebody tries to talk about it. If we react to the effort of trying to talk about it as if that's the threat, not our continued silence. We're doing a lot of damage to each succeeding generation. It's the 21st century, and there's still a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to Black and brown people in this country. We haven't created spaces in America that deal honestly with the legacy of slavery. My view is that the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. It was the narrative of racial difference that we created to justify it. We said black people are different than white people. They can't do this, they can't do that. The Supreme Court said they're 3/5 human. And this ideology of white supremacy, that narrative of racial difference, that was the true evil. So for me, slavery doesn't end in 1865, it just evolves. It turns into decades where we have terrorism and lynching, and our courts and our systems of government tolerated black people being pulled out of their homes and hung from trees, sometimes on the courthouse lawn. The legal system, the rule of law was complicit. The black people in Boston, the black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went there as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And then we lived through this period of civil rights struggle that had some success, but it didn't ultimately confront that narrative of racial difference. And so now we have a system of criminal justice administration that is very racialized, where we tolerate bias and inequality.
We're now going to travel 40 miles west to the city of Selma, where we'll meet Leonard Ingram, who joins his friends every weekday morning, 5 days a week for breakfast at the downtown restaurant. I'll be Leonard's reader, and Scott will be a compassionate listener. You all called a Republican to talk with you? I thought you'd go to the Democrats. I was born and raised here in Selma. My great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War between Marietta and Chickamauga. He was buried in a mass grave. I researched it. My grandmother, my mother, my daddy, my grandmother, my grandfather, and great-grandfather are all buried in the same cemetery 2 blocks from here, right behind the stadium. I was raised in a very conservative family. My mother and daddy were George Wallace conservative Democrats, 100%. Wallace gave the governor's tag to anybody who supported him. I put mine on the front of my little Corvair. I thought I was a big shot. Saved me a couple of speeding tickets. I met my wife at Auburn. I graduated, but she didn't. She got her MRS degree there. I got a degree as a mechanical engineer. We came back to Selma. Great place to live at one time. Not quite as good now. There's a lot of problems here, just like all cities, but I enjoy living here. It's a rural community, but it has a lot of opportunities. Anyway, I got myself a little construction company and did good. I helped design and build at least 7 or 8 different industries here. About 10 years ago, a friend of mine asked me to take over the Republican Party here. I'm the county chairman. You all asked about northern people versus southern people. We've had Yankees come here forever because of Craig Field. As far as I know, we always got along with northern people. Southerners are basically friendly. If they see you need help, they'll help you.
As a compassionate listener, Leonard, may I ask what the Edmund Pettus Bridge means to you?
Y'all don't want to hear what I think.
Oh, yes, we do. Please.
He who wins writes history. What you learned about Selma wasn't true. I had an elderly aunt, and somebody knocked on her door and told her that if she didn't get out on the street and march with the protesters, they were going to throw a rock through her window. She was scared to death. Here's another example. There was a guy named Charlie Jones. He had a smile about that wide, big old smile. His picture ended up on the cover of Look magazine. I still have a copy. They portrayed him to be one of the villains who beat people with billy sticks. It didn't happen. Charlie wouldn't touch nobody. That really hurt us. The main reason for not having the march was it was illegal. they never got a permit. Why? Because that was the only bridge for 50 miles upstream and downstream. If an emergency happened and the bridge was tied up, well, nowadays they won't let you close areas that have emergency needs. Back then, they let them do it. I thought many people were here just for the fun of it. We'll find the truth when they release the rest of Martin Luther King's records, which I understand won't happen until the year 2030. Now, why would they suppress those records?
Leonard, I appreciate your personal experience regarding the bridge. It might have been hard for you to talk about that, and I do value your desire for the truth to come out in the story about Look magazine. Thank you for agreeing to meet.
So again, make note of anything that might have surprised you, challenged you, something you want to know more about, something you learned, attributes that you see in common, and feel free to enter them into the chat. Later that same day, we met civil rights activist Diane Howard at Selma's historic Brown Chapel. She's another fiercely resilient Black woman who refuses to hate her oppressors. She described what it was like to be on the business end of Sheriff Jim Clark's billy clubs on Bloody Sunday. Her reader will be Nancy Jo Shabbat.
My full name is Thelma Diane Howard Harris. My brother and I were raised in a single-family home here in Selma. Our mother was a worker in the cigar factory. Every day she came home smelling like tobacco. I attended a Lutheran school. Many of our instructors were Lutheran pastors. At first, my mother didn't give us the opportunity to participate in the civil rights movement. Then one day, a student from the local high school came over to our school and invited us to participate. I was 15, my brother 13. I persuaded him to come along. He always obeyed his big sister. We left school and came down to this church and learned many freedom songs. The first one I learned was, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna keep on a-walking, keep on a-talking, marching up to freedom land." In our Lutheran church, most of our songs were German tunes. And here I am learning a freedom song. I felt like I had arrived. When we got home, I had to tell Mom that we left school. I thought I was going to get it. I told her, "We know you don't have the right to vote, so we decided to leave school for you, Mom." Phew, that was my life-saving moment. We ended up staying out of school for the rest of the week. We learned how to protect ourselves. We learned self-esteem lessons. It was a wonderful experience. One of the things we were taught was that if you could not be nonviolent, do not participate, because we would have gone against Dr. King's principles. I participated in 4 marches and was arrested twice. 200 of us were transported by school buses to a prison camp 7 miles west of Selma. We were treated as if we were criminals. We were packed like sardines, 25, 30 people to a cell. I was stuck with a cattle prod. It sent an electric shock to my body. Makes you yell, scream, cry. The boys were hit with billy clubs and nightsticks. It was a terrible night. I left very angry. I felt that we didn't deserve the treatment we got. What helped heal me was attending the Christian day school. Forgive those who trespass against you. On Bloody Sunday, my mother told us we could come to the church, but could not march. "No, ma'am," we said, "we won't." When we got down here, we heard all that good clapping and singing and speeches. I told my brother, "Let's get to the back of the line." He said, "Mom told us not to march." I said, "Come on, we'll be fine." It's a good thing we didn't make it the whole way to the bridge. When we smelled the tear gas and heard people yelling and screaming, we held on to each other and ran back to the church. We passed a lady who was a little younger than I am now. She was trying to run back to the church. We got on both sides of her and tried to hold her up. Finally, she said, "Children, go on, I can't keep up." We looked back and saw a posse man on horseback beating her down with a billy club. Even now, that's very emotional for me. After he finished with her, he came after us. Talk about two little children running as fast as they could. We couldn't wait to see the steps of that church. That horse actually climbed right up the church steps. We know it was God who saved us. When we got home, Mom wasn't having any of it. She held me responsible as the oldest. I deserved it because we could have gotten hurt, possibly killed. My final march was to Montgomery. That was so exciting. One of my proudest moments with Mom was when she volunteered to house a married white couple from New York. I gave up my bedroom. They stayed with us for an entire week. The Teamsters Union provided a fleet of Greyhound buses that stretched as far as the eyes could see. We were told to bring our quilts and pillows because we were going to spend the night. We enjoyed that wonderful concert where all the movie stars came to Montgomery. They gave up their time and their talent as a community service to us. 25,000 people gathered that day. In his How Long, Not Long speech, Dr. King said, "They told us we wouldn't get here, but we are here. And we are here to tell the world we ain't gonna let nobody turn us around." I have a passion for talking with young folks. It gives me an opportunity to help them understand why they enjoy their freedoms. They don't have a clue. We're still begging people to register and vote. That breaks my heart, knowing that so many of us have been beaten and bludgeoned for you to have this right and you don't appreciate it. I want students to see how my story affects their lives today. People put their lives on the line. When a certain group of people isn't free, nobody is free. The struggle continues. I will never give up as long as I'm able to walk that bridge with tour groups, as long as God gives me the strength to tell the story. A lot of progress has been made since 1965. We haven't arrived. We may never, but we're not going back.
Something that surprised you, challenged you, something you learned, something you want to know more about, attributes or values that speakers might share. So now we're going to take a few minutes for Scott and Nancy Jo to share their impressions and recollections and what the trip meant to them. Scott?
Firstly, tonight, I wish to honor Tom McSteen. We spoke frequently about humanness and what it requires. Truth be told, my own path to Alabama was hardly linear. I understood very little of Black history and racism as a teenager. I lived in a neighborhood with few, if any, Black residents, and in retrospect, the closest emotional parallel to bigotry I experienced was the deeply embedded vulnerability I inherited from my parents due to our Jewishness and the lessons of World War II. I became an ardent Zionist, protective of my tribe, left for Israel during the Yom Kippur War and lived there for quite some time and adhered only to the official Zionist narrative. While in Israel, though, I also failed to meet a single Palestinian, nor seek the personal stories that best define our perspectives and experiences. Decades passed, and over this long period, the doubts accumulated. I read deeply and communicated frequently with diverse individuals about social justice issues associated with Israel-Palestine, and the complicity I experienced having neglected other perspectives burrowed its way into my spirit as a wound that still will not heal. It was in this context that I joined the Compassionate Listening Journey to Israel-Palestine in 2016. A remarkable experience that reinforced my belief that if we are ever to bridge these divisions, we must touch our shared humanity. Fast forward several years and now better informed as to how historical racism and white supremacy became culturally embedded here in the US. The opportunity to join Yale on a race-related mission predicated on compassionate listening projects, person-to-person model, became an imperative, and the experience was transformative. We met with a number of individuals in short order, and I believe it was only the second or third day in Alabama. I recall turning to Joel and Nancy Jo at lunch, and literally with a broken voice saying, "And we thought Israel-Palestine was a complicated social and political dilemma. For the love of God, establish borders and move on. But this capacity for racism and slavery, the compartmentalization of values and the perpetual dehumanization of the other is the real tragedy. How does this happen and what can we do?" And that is why I'm here tonight. And I thank all of you.
I'd gone twice on compassionate listening journeys in Israel and Palestine and knew that these journeys took place in other conflict areas. But this was the first time in the US, and it was in Alabama, which stirred a lot of things for me. I live in New Hampshire now, but I grew up in Maryland, which is sometimes identified as a Southern state. But my family's identity was as Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe coming to the US in the early 1900s through New York. Family got down to Maryland in the early 1960s when my dad got a job on Capitol Hill. But my oldest brother was born in Alabama, and my dad was stationed in the Army during the Korean conflict. This was at a time when living areas were segregated, store counters were segregated, water fountains were segregated. My mother, at the age of about 21, became the first professional special ed teacher in the public schools of Northern Alabama. She was there right at the time of school desegregation, and her school was one of the ones that Governor George Wallace came to with the Alabama National Guard to block the doors of the school. The story I've heard is that one of the more seasoned teachers who knew her way around found an unguarded entrance and went in and opened those front doors from the back and wagged her fingers at the young men of the National Guard and said, "Shame on you," and that George Wallace never returned to that school. Miss Diane, whose transcript I read, reminded me of in some indescribable ways of my mother. And I had lunch with Miss Diane one day on the trip, and I told her that. And she told me that she was a special ed teacher in that same school in Huntsville, Alabama, about 10 years after my mother. So my reflection is that I went to Alabama to do compassionate listening, but it gave me all of these connections and stories that were complicated. And I guess I take that with me as I explore the things that I do in New Hampshire and New England, primarily Native history, past and present, and racial history.
Thanks, Scott and Nancy Jo. I'm going to share the screen again. And just close with a couple of quotes. I want to come back to our original question. How do you simultaneously stand up for justice and listen open-heartedly to those with whom you disagree? How do you let nobody turn you around and affirm the humanity of those who just as soon turn you around and send you home? So here are several quotes that encapsulate the dynamic tension that accompanied us on our journey. This first, of course, from Coretta Scott King. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. And from Martin Luther King Jr. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And this final one from Leah Green, who's a co-founder of the Compassionate Listening Project. This is an important time of calling out the isms and stepping forward as allies, but it's equally important that we call in compassion as the very ground that we stand on to do this hard work of unpacking and healing eons of pain, abuse, domination, genocide, and slavery. Otherwise, it's just about changing who's on top, which perpetuates the dominator model rather than heals it. So now we want to hear from you. Questions, comments, reflections, responses to everything that we said. And for that, I'm going to ask Amy to moderate and respond to some of the comments that you put into the chat.
Yeah, well, I'm partly just going to share all the, some of the things that people have put out there. I have a couple of them are questions, but I'm not sure they have answers. Let's see. We've got Sharon. Force of life nourishes even secondhand at this distance. I'm going to get back to Judy's question. Sharon then said, I am so moved by the force of Christian love. There is something crucial to be learned here. And I am surprised about the info about Lincoln. Judy said, I'm struck by the nuance in these situations. Patricia went on about that bit about Lincoln needs more information. He was for the Union more than anything else. And maybe I should say we definitely weren't putting that out as the true history. We were sharing it as what the man that was being quoted. Yeah, do look it up. It was remarked that it must have been very emotional to visit that museum. And Anne said she's struck with how long overdue the Legacy Museum is. So critical to understand how things look from the other side. And now a couple questions. First, I'm going to ask one that, again, I'm not sure really, it's more an encapsulation of what we're wrestling with. And that is, Judy wondered, how do we reconcile the recent vote by Alabama legislature to forbid trans kids from playing on girls' teams? And what about Georgia recent voter suppression laws? I don't know if any of our Joel or Nancy Jo or Scott want to speak to that at all. Again, I'm not sure there's an answer, but maybe one of you wants to say something on it before we close here, which we are close to doing.
I'll defer to Scott and Nancy Jo. I've done a lot of talking tonight.
I'll just very quickly say, and certainly leave space for Nancy Jo as well. I guess my only response is, that politics runs deep, and it's the common currency of dialogue and policy these many years, and so I don't think anything has changed really. Everybody is self-opportunistically trying to gain advantage, bottom line.
So we do need to wrap up, and there's a question here about the, now there's some great questions coming in. I'm sorry, we don't have more time, but there's some questions coming in about the programs, the compassionate listening tours. Joel, do you want to share that slide?
Sure.
Joel's going to say a little something about how you can join in.
Yeah, so one more quote. This one's from Brian Stevenson's grandmother. She said, you can't understand most of the important things from a distance, Brian. You have to get close. So if any of you are interested in getting close by joining the Compassionate Listening Project's next journey to Alabama, not yet scheduled, but I'm confident will take place, you can contact us at compassionatelistening.org, or if it's easier, you can email me, and I'll be sure to pass on the your interest to the trip organizers. And you can also find out a lot of information about compassionate listening on the website. It's been around for about 25 years. There have been 34 journeys, most of them to Israel, Palestine, some to Sub-Saharan Africa, some to Northern Ireland. This was the first, but not the last, to hotspots right here in the United States. I wish we had more time. We could spend an hour just talking about the Compassionate Listening Project.
Well, maybe we will have you back to do just that. But for now, yes, I am going to wrap it up. Let me just say that we'd love you to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action, nhpeaceaction.org. You can also look us up on Facebook to learn more about what we're working on and what's next in this series. The very next one is going to be April 12, 7 to 8 p.m. And it's going to feature another program about questioning division. Bruce Gagnon will speak to the question, is Russia truly our enemy? This series is free and open to everyone. However, if you are able to contribute at this time, your financial support is really appreciated so we can keep doing our work. I'm going to put into the chat the link to do so if you are able. And then I just want to invite you all to join me in a visible thanking. I will tell you that Nancy, Joe, Joel, Scott worked very, very hard on this presentation. They put really a lot into it, not, going obviously and doing it, but also just prepping for tonight. So I'd really like us to tell them thank you. And thank you all.